Today's interview is with Louis Sheats. Louis is the director of the Chaifetz Center for Entrepreneurship at St. Louis University. Louis assumed this position in November 2021, following 20 years at North Carolina State as the executive director of the Entrepreneurship Clinic, assistant vice provost, and associate professor in the Poole College of Management. Mr. Sheats has parallel careers as an academic and an entrepreneur with an extensive background in new venture planning, concept consulting, opportunity creation, marketing, and strategic planning. Welcome, Louis.
Thank you, Philip. Thanks for having me.
You were hired by the Chaifetz School of Business to bring the Entrepreneurship Center and program to the next level. How do you define the next level?
Yeah, for me, it's really about how do we get our students engaged in entrepreneurial and experiential learning? How do we embed them in the entrepreneurial ecosystem? And it's ultimately developing that pathway of success for them. So where we might have, when I first started teaching 20 years ago, been focused on business plans, now I'm really focused on developing mindsets and getting students to land in the right place. That might be launching their own company, but the majority of them aren't. So finding the right company to go add value to and build a career and an impact.
What areas of University Entrepreneurship Center operations are most challenging, and how do you address those challenges?
You mentioned in my intro, I am an entrepreneur and an accidental academic. I think my biggest challenge is the rate of which we move sometimes. I am an entrepreneur first and foremost. I like to move fast. I have that mindset of building unlimited resources, and time is one of the most important ones. And universities don't quite think the same way, and they're a little slower and archaic. So that's always been my biggest challenge, but I've been really lucky at being with the right support team around me, deans from back in the day at North Carolina State, now here at St. Louis University, giving me enough freedom to operate and build. But overcoming that's how we might move a little slower. And then I think the second piece that's we sometimes overlook is that we built this 16-week chunk every 3 months that students have to go through, and the rest of the world doesn't revolve in those 16-week chunks. So having to create these artificial timelines for students sometimes is hard for us to truly make that impact without losing them to spring break or summer or winter break.
In announcing your move to St. Louis in November of 2021, you stated, "My goal is to make SLU, St. Louis University, the #1 entrepreneurship program in the country. And I think we have all of the pieces in place to do that." What investment, resources, assets, and commitment does it take for a university to achieve such a top ranking?
Yeah, it's not just the university. That's the key. Like, it's not just the university has to invest in this. It's got to be the community that's believing in this vision and investing as well. On the university side, I'm a true believer it's got to be across the entire university. It can't just be in the business school or just in the engineering school. It has to connect. And one of the reasons I took this job was this pull from engineering, the med school, the law school, even the social sciences, including the business school, wanting this pull for entrepreneurship for all students to sort of think differently, to think like an entrepreneur, and make them better engineers or make them better doctors, make them better lawyers or better business students. So that has to be part of it, but it can't be just that. It's got to be investment from the community, meaning they show up for mentor events. They invest in alumni. They provide guidance, advice, feedback for students, again, identifying that pathway of success for them. It's when we get all of those pieces together and that time commitment and investment The money is definitely got to be there. We've got to hire people. We've got to put students in internships in companies that might not be able to afford internships. We need to subsidize that. Those types of investment really is going to boost us to the #1 entrepreneurship program.
Tactically speaking, how do you engage, the St. Louis business community? Where do you start, or where did you start? And then, what, because, our audience here is entrepreneurship center directors, and, what can they do? What are some of the takeaways that you can provide on engaging the local business community?
I think the low-hanging fruit, the easy ones, are the ones that are already in the ecosystem, like angel groups and venture capital groups that are looking for technology or companies that are going to spin out of the university. Like, knocking on those doors, there's a natural connection. What I think the difference maker is changing that story and going to the bigger companies like Boeing here in St. Louis or Bayer, and showing them that an entrepreneurial minded student is going to add value to their company, even though they're not a new venture by any means, but they're looking for these types of creative thinkers, design thinking, and entrepreneurial mindset from all across the university, that we're going to be able to add value, and we're the pipeline for them. So again, thinking about it from a standpoint of, we've got students that launch companies, but most of them go work for other companies. That was really my first approach, is like getting the story correct and making sure it got out to as many people as possible in the ecosystem, from what happens to our students when they graduate. That's the first step. I think then it's getting them to show up while they're here. I talk all the time about universities and colleges are very important. Obviously, I work for a university. I believe in the education system. I think it's important for most students to go to a university. But the real value is what happens before and after class. And that has to be that community engagement. So getting them to show up on campus, or getting our students to show up in their space, is really that component that creates that engagement, where we start seeing this impact on students and then the companies in the ecosystem.
You've said that a focus on engagement and embeddedness within the ecosystem, that's what you focus on. Also, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is a top priority for universities, which you mentioned. So how do you change the perception of what entrepreneurship is for students across all disciplines, as well as for those underrepresented by gender or race?
My first approach is role modeling, right? So it's obvious, I'm a white male, right? So I can't role model necessarily for an underrepresented student. So again, going back out into the community and telling that story, I need you to show up, to show these students that whether they're female or Black or underrepresented race, that there are other people that have been successful, and we have a community that really cares about you being successful. And we're going to show you that by showing up to our events, to our classes, and we're going to invite you into our spaces. So having students go into a Black-run entrepreneurial venture, for example, and seeing that connection, not just a Black student, but all students, to recognize that entrepreneurship is the ultimate leveling playing field, right? If you teach a student, no matter what their background, how to think like an entrepreneur, it gives them that chance to have that leg up and create value where they might not have had that opportunity elsewhere. So role modeling is the first component. The second component is really about building confidence in the students, no matter what their backgrounds are, that they have the right to be here and they have the tools to actually be successful. They just need to put them in place. And the support system that's around them is going to do as much as we can to help prevent them from failing, or at least failing in a way that's not recoverable.
Along those lines, how important are the terms that we use for innovation and entrepreneurship in motivating and including students across all the disciplines? One of the things that I'm hearing is that perhaps we should move on from the term entrepreneur to a more inclusive term like change maker. So, does entrepreneurship, the term entrepreneurship, have exclusionary associations that you want to avoid?
If you think about the history of the word, right, I remember when I first started teaching at NC State, my grandmother, for example, saw the word as an entrepreneur as a negative, right? Like someone that took advantage of people to make money, right? The perception, especially coming from the Great Depression, there was a lot of negatives around what the word entrepreneurship means. I'm not a marketer by any means. I've named companies and had to change them a year later because I messed up on those. So coming up with the right word is probably not going to be what I'm going to be able to do. But what I can do is make sure that the word entrepreneurship still means something and it's inviting to other people. I agree. The term change maker is important, and we know what it means. But I think where entrepreneurship sort of differentiates is it gives people that freedom to think differently and then make that impact no matter where they are, in a lifestyle hobby business or in a large organization that's been established for over 100 years. We can sort of place students in those different areas. And I'm not ready to give up on the word entrepreneurship yet. I think there's a lot of value to it. We just need to make sure we tell the story correctly.
There are a lot of centers for entrepreneurship, which would have challenges. And
a lot of expensive name changing going on across the country. Yes,
exactly. Not many, very few, in fact, executive directors of entrepreneurship centers have experience at more than one university. NC State, where you were the executive director of entrepreneurship, is the largest university in the University of North Carolina system, with 26,000 undergraduate students, 10,000 graduate students, 9,000 faculty across 11 colleges, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. St. Louis University, on the other hand, is a private Jesuit research university with 8,000 students and 5,000 graduate students. From a center operations perspective, Louis, what are the differences between managing the SLU Chaifetz Center for Entrepreneurship and the NC State Entrepreneurship Clinic?
Yeah, obviously the pool was a lot bigger at North Carolina State. So that's a factor, but it's not really that big of a factor. In fact, I think coming to SLU gave me an opportunity to reach more students, because even though there were more students in the bucket at NC State, access to them was probably more siloed than at SLU, for example. That's smaller, more connected, because it has to be, right? You can't create a silo around a school of only 900 students like you could create a silo around a school or college with 5,000 or 6,000 students. It's easier to do that in those large institutions. One other big component between those two was, I was at North Carolina State for 20 years as a faculty member, but I was also an undergrad there. I was a student from North Carolina State. So I spent the majority of my life on that campus, and leaving there was a really tough decision because of that connection. But also I was nervous about leaving that big public, and so especially at North Carolina State, where the students have this grit and resilience about them because they're coming from the state of North Carolina. A lot of them are first or second generation college students, and then coming to that, like you mentioned, a Jesuit private research institution, smaller, in a more urban setting, that maybe I would lose some of that grit and resilience, but I actually found it to be equal in terms of this grittiness and resiliency that maybe comes from the city of St. Louis, and also this service component to the Jesuit mission, that students are still willing to roll up their sleeves and get stuff done. So the quality of the student was really exciting to me. Even though the number of students were fewer, I'm able to reach a lot more of them.
Interesting. At NC State, you applied the hospital teaching model applied to entrepreneurship education, and this created a cross-disciplined approach and environment across the many colleges there. Okay, what approach to entrepreneurship are you applying now at SLU?
So definitely still using the hospital teaching model. The clinical model, which I developed at State, was a way to embed students in that ecosystem and engage them in experiential learning, and also try to invite students across the entire campus. I'm really proud of the fact when we started that at NC State, we started with 9 students, all of which were coming from the business school. When I left NC State, there were just under 300 students. Half of them were from the business school and the other were from engineering, agriculture, social sciences, all across the campus, in design and textiles, all across campus to engage in that clinical model. So doing that here at SLU is definitely something that we're standing up. We've already done it in some small pockets. We don't have the physical space yet, working on it, almost there. And engaging with the community takes more time for me because I don't have that network that I'd built 20 years at NC State. So we're definitely taking that approach. My thought and belief in entrepreneurship education is it's a practice. You have to do it. You can't learn entrepreneurship by reading a book. You have to get your hands dirty. You got to experience what entrepreneurship is. The clinical model really does that well. In addition to that, we're building programs for what happens to students before they ever get here. So we're going backwards into the high school education and providing summer academies. We're working with students while they're in school during the semesters, and then we're going past graduation at SLU to what happens to them. So accelerators, non-equity funding models for them, and really building this entire pipeline of, from that 14-year-old kid to the, 30-year-old entrepreneur, all the components that SLU can help them along that way and eliminate some of the mistakes, create a better chance of success, and also show them that they have a meaningful support system to make sure they create that impact that they're meant to do.
The Chaifetz Center provides several high school programs. This is somewhat unique for centers that do not engage with high school students, most. What are the benefits that accrue to universities and to entrepreneurship centers to justify setting up such programs?
I think, I love this because it goes to the mission that SLU has in terms of the service to community. We're not necessarily doing this to recruit students to SLU. What I do it for is to get students excited about entrepreneurship. And that means that they could end up in many different universities, or maybe they don't go to university at all, but they get that bug and that excitement about entrepreneurship. And that's a win for us because it creates our city becomes better, our ecosystem becomes better, and it just becomes this flywheel effect. I think the other components are, it's great for the students that are here at SLU. They get to mentor and engage with those students and to teach us to learn. So for our students to be able to teach those students in high school, it gives them an opportunity to truly understand what we're trying to teach them in the classroom, because they have to now go teach it to these high school students. So there's a win for the students at St. Louis University by working with the students that are the local high schools or in the high schools in Missouri and Illinois to be able to engage in that. And then at the end of the day, we're creating an opportunity for these high school students that might not necessarily have that chance to understand what entrepreneurship is, what that mindset can do for them. And because of the schools that we can recruit from, we can help give them that leg up that I mentioned earlier that entrepreneurship really can provide.
In light of the Columbia University debacle, where Columbia University acknowledged that it had been submitting inaccurate data to the U.S. News and World Report for their annual college rankings, how should we, at universities, parents, students, et cetera, how should we interpret and how important are Princeton review results when even schools that report accurate data still try to game the ranking system?
Yeah, it's such a weird subject. I'm not a fan of rankings for the most part because of I'm not going to name the names, but some are based on popularity because deans vote on them. Some of them are based on data that's submitted by directors like me, and then some are a combination. And what I would give it, what the advice I'd give to any parent or any high school student looking at entrepreneurship programs is dig a little deeper. I think that's a great start. Like take the list and the rankings and really dig deeper. Go hop on a Zoom call with a director or a faculty member at these schools and see how you connect with them. It's a starting point for you, but it's not the end all to make a decision on what's the best school for you. Because whether a school is ranked number one in entrepreneurship in any of those rankings doesn't necessarily mean it's a great school for you as an 18-year-old. And it's really about that whole approach. So use it as what it is. It's a list of schools that have focused on entrepreneurship, but dig deeper into what it really means to you.
As one of the leaders in the field, what are your thoughts on the evolution over the past 20 years of entrepreneurship programs in universities in terms of the role, position, and teaching methodologies?
Yeah, I mean, when I started teaching in 2001, I think, and then really full-time in 2002, we mainly only taught business students, and our main goal was for them to write a business plan. I fell in love with being in the classroom with students back then because I love being in that ideation phase. I'm good at that as an entrepreneur, and being with students, it gave me this energy that constantly was, rebuilt every semester. But I also felt like we were doing a disservice to students as I really got into what we were teaching them and what we were focusing on. And that shifted away from so much focus on a business plan that in reality, most people are never going to read, right? I'm not knocking the planning component. I think those components are important and we need to look into those, but to be so focused back then and back then it was literally printing out books of paper on a business plan was a disservice. So, and now you look at today where we really focus on the different components of how do we get students to think differently and come up and recognize opportunities, whether they're in the large corporations or launching their own. That's got to be a major component. And then what do you do after that? So the simplest way, again, I'm not an academic, I'm an accidental academic. The simplest way I've defined the entrepreneurial mindset for students is first, you have to recognize either the problem or the gap or the change that's happening that you can take advantage of. The second component is building a team and a solution that can do that. And then the third component is really articulating that to the right people. So identifying the correct stakeholders, whether they be future team members or customers or investors, being able to tell that message and get them to buy into it. I mean, it's all three of those components that have changed the way or the focus of what we're teaching in the classroom, of getting them to follow those three pieces. That applies whether you're working in the big company or the small company. It doesn't matter. You can take that approach and add value immediately.
If we measure, I remember reading this, that we measure student generations in 4-year cycles. So at this point, you've experienced 5+ generations of student entrepreneurs.
Wow.
What have you seen? What are the generational changes that have most influenced you on how you deliver your entrepreneurship programs? And how do students today differ from students in the early part of the 20th century?
Probably the biggest change is access and exposure, right? They have more access to people across the world today than they did in 2000 when I started 2001 when I started teaching. Exposure, we talk about this all the time. There are great entrepreneurship professors, entrepreneurs, thought leaders online every day posting YouTube videos, TikTok videos, access to knowledge there that you didn't have access to 20 years ago. So that has really changed the way students already identify and take in that knowledge and information. Today, it's really about how do we get them to do something with it? I taught a class last night. We were talking about an entrepreneur on TikTok, and students were really excited about, and they're repeating what we say in class. That's good for me, right? When they're listening to an entrepreneur on TikTok talk about product market fit, and then they can come back into class and talk about product market fit when I'm trying to get them to believe in product market fit. That's a bonus, right? Versus 20 years ago, they had to just trust me, right? And maybe I wasn't even trustworthy 20 years ago. I was young. I didn't know what I was doing when I first started. So that is one of the biggest changes. I think the other piece is like, I don't know that this has changed, but this has always been the exciting part for me. You take a 22-year-old undergrad student graduating with an entrepreneurial mindset and degree, like being able to see their entire life in front of them. I think today they realize that it can be more than just the traditional, I'm gonna do the same thing for 20 years. I'm gonna add impact and change the world. Like, and they can. And that's the cool thing, that they believe it and they really can do it if they put their mind to it. And that's not necessarily a huge change from 20 years ago, but I think there's probably more of them accepting the fact that they can do that.
Innovation and entrepreneurship are the perfect vehicles for helping socioeconomic mobility. Why are innovation and entrepreneurship today any more or less effective than innovation and entrepreneurship at any other time in American history?
I mean, the major piece has got to be the speed that we're moving, especially around technology, right? I mean, you and I are able to do this in 2 different cities. I think we might be in 2 different time zones, like connecting across barriers that existed that are now gone away. And you know, COVID was a really bad thing for a lot of us and our economy and our world, but it also changed the way we interact in a positive way, where getting on a Zoom call with an entrepreneur that's in California or on the East Coast or in Asia or in Europe for a student in the middle of the US is no longer a barrier, right? Before COVID, for example, students might have thought, well, that's weird. I wouldn't have done that. I'm not going to do it. Like, but now I can get them to do it, right? So having access to people is a huge change that we're experiencing. The speed of technology where students can, you know, when I was in school, if I had, there was no such thing as an app, but if I had to write an app back then, like where would I have gone? What would I have done? Versus today, a student can come up with a great idea and build minimal viable products much quicker than they could have 20 years ago. They can get it in front of early adopters much quicker than they could 20 years ago. And that's really, I think, the biggest difference, the speed that we're moving, access to people, and then the access and change in technology that we're experiencing really does make a big difference.
For many of us, COVID was a forced experiment to get universities to focus on the questions of what is it about the on-campus experience that is special? What do you see as the convening power of universities versus, say, doing everything online?
Yeah, I love this question because, again, it referenced back to a couple of things I've said earlier in terms of the knowledge is everywhere, right? Students have access to knowledge without having to enroll in a university and sit in the class. That's important, and I'm not discounting that. But being here, being present, really leads to those, as a former colleague at NC State used to pin it, is beneficial collisions. Getting students in the same space where they're colliding with other students, whether they are cross-discipline, in the hallway, in the center, in the opportunity areas that we created for them. That's the value. Like, what are you doing before and after class that's really changing your life? Last night, again, referencing class last night, I teach at 6 o'clock. I'm heading up there at 5:45. We spend 15 to 20 minutes with students in the hallway that are running into other faculty members. We talk about their ideas. We're creating an opportunity for them to be themselves, to share their ideas, where in the classroom we do that, but it's not as intimidating perhaps, or it gives them more of a chance to showcase themselves, and it gives them a chance to connect with other people that might not necessarily feel comfortable in that classroom setting to do so. So that's really the value of the college experience, is what's happening before and after class, and what are you doing about that?
As an associate professor, you taught all of the entrepreneurship courses at NC State. How important is it for a university entrepreneurship center director to also be an educator?
Yeah, I don't see how people do it and not do both. For me personally, it's the greatest experience I get out of the whole position is engaging with students in the classroom and recognizing how I can impact them and how they impact me through those 16-week chunks that we go through. It's also important for me to do that so I understand and have a pulse on what they're thinking. What do they need? Like, what do they need from a center? Where do they want it? How do they want to engage with a center? And if I'm not in that classroom, it's hard for me to gather that information. It was a deal breaker, not a deal breaker. It was a request that if I took this center position, that I would also be a professor and teach in the entrepreneurship program. It was originally not written that way. It was a separate position that was not going to be necessarily teaching in the classroom. For me, it was the component that has to happen. You've got to be in the classroom engaging with students so you can hear what they're saying and what they need and what they want, so we can build appropriately from a center perspective.
Along those lines, Louis, entrepreneurship, what's so important is customer discovery phase. If you look at a university, there are 20 plus customer segments, be it from, parents, trustees, alumni, young alumni, mid-career alumni, faculty across disciplines, local business community. I mean, there's a lot of customer segments that an entrepreneurship center has to deal with. When you were, going into the Chaifetz Center, in advance, how did you address that? Was there a customer discovery period that you went through?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, I'm coming up on my 1-year anniversary, and all of those segments that you talked about, I had to get engaged and hear from them what do we need, and add on to that, I'm coming into a completely new ecosystem. So it might not even be a customer of St. Louis University yet, right? I have to go out and talk to the ecosystem of, what do you look for from a student that's going to graduate from SLU? How do we make sure we're delivering that? So the North Star for me is always the students, right? So when listening to students and understanding what they need and what we can provide them, that's the first component for me. And then it spreads out from there. Like faculty, staff, alumni, entrepreneurs, recruiters, investors, change makers in the city, hearing all of that feedback. And then that's the hard part of the job, right? Or the fun part of the job is putting all that together, right? You can't make everybody happy. But we've got to focus. That's why it always comes back to the students for me. What's going to be the best thing for them in the long run? And then if I keep that thought, no matter who I'm talking to in those segments of customers through customer discovery, it always sort of brings me back into the right place of, right, this is what we need to be focused on. This is what we need to be doing today, but we also need to be really flexible enough to be able to change tomorrow. Again, going back to me being an entrepreneur, constantly living in a resource constrained environment, like you have to be thinking that way, even though I'm in a large institution like a university here at SLU. You still got to think about it from a perspective of what are we building today, and then how do we change it tomorrow based on what those customers are telling us.
Universities are using many of the same tools for teaching and encouraging innovation and entrepreneurship. For example, lean startup, customer discovery, business model canvas, jobs to be done, scientific method, et cetera, et cetera. What makes one university's entrepreneurship program different from another?
It goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's like, what are we doing? What are we doing with that, right? What are we doing before and after class with those students so they can actually put that to practice? How do we get them into the ecosystem where they're getting true feedback and getting that true experience. So when they graduate, they're in a better place and a better chance of success. All those tools are important, right? We use those tools as well, but they're just tools. It's like if it was a traditional tool bag where you give me a hammer and a screwdriver and a drill and a level, that's great until you actually let me use them and understand how to build the cabinet or build the piece of furniture. Like that's what we're trying to do, is like, how do you get them out and actually experience that and use those tools that we're providing them and teaching them in the classroom? That's the big difference. So, and I think that goes back to the faculty that we have, the support system that we're creating for the students, not just on campus, but off campus, that really makes the big difference.
The certainly there's what goes on in the classroom, but there's also what goes on outside of the classroom. And so, for example, the core of Lean Startup is talking to customers. Okay.
Yeah.
It's more than just talking, of course. How do you teach students to conduct customer interviews that yield desired outcomes in terms of clean feedback? I'm rereading. I don't know if you're familiar with the MOM test, but this seems to me to be pretty much the hardest part of entrepreneurship, getting a company started, and to actually be able to articulate the need and the product or service that you're looking to do. How do you get students to learn that, or is it best to just expose them and then say this is something that's very important when you are in that position?
Yeah, so I mean, that's the beauty of what we do, right? We can create that setting in that environment where we can get them exposed, but then also teach them what they did right and wrong, right? So we actually have students go through the interview process. I go through a couple stages, but depending on the class, where in one class I might just have them, you got to go interview 20 people, right? And we give them some structure around it, but like half the battle is just getting them to do it. And it's not necessarily that what they're getting from the interview is as important to me at that stage. It's just getting them to do it, right? Versus later on, as we get them more comfortable, then we can create scenarios inside the classroom, or inside our classroom might not be a traditional classroom, right? It might be in a incubator or a co-working space, and have students go through this interview process and have other people watching and learn as it's happening. We have entrepreneurs do it, we have students do it, and it goes back to this hospital clinical model where we're trying to expose them while it's happening, and then they're learning through that process. Because you're right, you can't just come up with a list of 10 questions, say, here, go talk to 20 people and ask them these 10 questions, right? It doesn't work that way. They need to experience and learn the nuances of what they're hearing, and then you're spot on in terms of then how do you articulate it back to the people you're trying to convince, whether it be that team member, investor, or a customer at that point. But we really do it by doing it. We get them exposed to it, and we create that experience so they learn from it.
I always think that this is a perfect situation for being inclusive across other disciplines. I think about when I started my company. In retrospect, the first person I should have hired would have been my daughter, not because she's my daughter, but because she is a psychology major. So she knows how to talk to people. She knows how to do that kind of research. Do you bring in, is that kind of the, for team building? Is that something that you advocate and promote?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's one of the reasons that I started recruiting across campus in the beginning, was that whether I had an engineering student or a business student, they needed those soft skills of being able to communicate and listen, right? So back when I was teaching at State, I'd have someone that was an expert in listening that would come in, and we'd work with our students just on listening, right? You don't get a lot of listening classes anywhere, really. Like we did focus on those types of things, so students recognize how important it was. in the clinical model, we spend a couple of weeks just on team building. We get them to interview each other, understand why you would build a team with one person and not another person. And it's not necessarily that you like one better than the other. It's more about like which one has a better strength that helps your weakness, right? And getting them to get past those components that typically you don't think about when you're just stuck in a classroom. So yeah, absolutely. We get them to do it, and then we teach them what they're doing as they're doing it.
There are many approaches to mentoring for entrepreneurs, as there are types of entrepreneurship programs. Where does mentoring for students fit into your vision of a 21st century education?
It was the first program that I started when I got to SLU. The program we built at NC State, I was so impressed with the impact it was having on students and mentors that I wanted to replicate and build that here. And one of the things that I think differentiates us in this mentoring program is that our approach is a many-to-many mentor program, meaning that we don't artificially connect students with mentors. The traditional models you'd see an alum or successful entrepreneur, send you an email, say, I want to help students. And then you connect them with the students, say, all right, cool, here's your mentee and your mentor. That typically doesn't work, right? You have to connect with people. You got to like each other. You got to be able to communicate. So we threw that out and we started this many-to-many approach where we get our group of mentors in a room, we get our group of mentees in a room, and we create an environment that starts building these social relationships and these social connections. I've always said today is truly important, but it's really like what's happening 5 years from now. Can we build these relationships with students and mentors that 5 years from now, students or alumni at that point are completely comfortable texting that mentor, emailing, meeting for coffee without me personally or the university being a bottleneck for them having that access. One of the awesome components that came out of that was because we weren't artificially connecting mentors and mentees, we had cross connection in both groups. So students were connecting with other students. They were in some ways mentoring underclassmen and upperclassmen and mentoring underclassmen, or other disciplines mentoring other disciplines. And then we saw it connecting in other mentors. So my approach is mentors should be, I use 24 to 84, right? I want a mentor that just got out of university, and I want a mentor that's experienced life, and I want everything in between. And because of that, you get this cross connection in the mentor group as well. So you might have mentors mentoring mentors. You might have mentors investing with each other. You have mentors going to play golf or grabbing coffee together. And then that becomes these connection points. So you don't need one person connecting all the students. So I might have a student that's talking to one mentor about a subject, and that mentor says, you really need to meet so-and-so in the group. And they knew them because they had coffee 2 weeks ago, and it starts to spread. And the impact is amazing for us. We actually have a mentor event tonight where we have 50 people showing up, about 25 and 25 mentors and students. And we're going to create an environment to start building those social relationships. And we just continue to do that. And the impact is really awesome to watch.
Sometimes you need an expert, subject matter expert. It's how do you balance, or how do you enable the students at the center to have access to both mentors and subject matter experts? And I mean, how do you present the two? How do you leverage the two?
Yeah, it's a great question. You can be a mentor and a subject matter expert, but you don't have to be both.
Yeah.
That's the difference for me. Like in fact, when I talk to people that want to be in our mentor program, mentors that want to be in our mentor program, a lot of times they'll ask me about like what concepts are students working on, what companies are they launching, and I'll have to back them up and say that's not what we're doing. That's not the focus, right? It's more about mentoring them at a stage in their life when they need to hear from other people that have experienced it. That might be launching a company, but a lot of them aren't, like I've said. So how do they know what job to take? How do they know what team member to recruit? How do they really those life and soft skills that they need as that in that age bracket that they're living through then? When it comes to that subject matter expert, we categorize them as advisors, and we make sure people understand the difference. The mentor is this holistic approach of how I'm going to be here as a support system for you and help you as you move on through life. The advisor is going to be there for one particular thing. Like if you need help on fundraising, all right, here's an advisor that can help you on your pitch or building a revenue model or teaching you, valuations, right? And they're going to be that, right? That person could also be a mentor, but that's not what you're coming to them in the mentor program for, right? And we try to create that separation by just making sure that story is clear. Like the advisors are one role, and they're going to be, I don't like using this word, but more transactional, right? We're looking at one thing that they're really focused on versus a mentor. It's the relationship, and having those different components is important.
How do you train your mentors? A number of universities have very clearly articulated guidelines, and do's, don'ts, et cetera. But how are you training and providing guidance for your mentors?
Yeah, we typically start out each semester with a mentor only meeting and a mentee only meeting. So we separate the two groups, and we give them, we don't necessarily give them the do's and don'ts, right? I don't want it to be that strict, but I appreciate that. Like I've had issues in the past where mentors or mentees just didn't play the right role, and that's my responsibility to either correct it or remove them, right? That's only happened one time in 20 years, so it doesn't happen that often. But we have those early meetings so we can talk to each group and say, this is what you should expect. This is what you should contribute. And for the mentee side, it's important because we want them to know showing up that it's not just take. You can't just show up and take, right? You have to be giving something back to the mentors that are providing to you as well. And then for the mentors, it's the same thing, right? You're not just giving, you're here to receive as well. So and that's how relationships work. If you have that one-sided relationship where it's just give or take, you don't have a real relationship. You have somebody that uses people, right? You're using one side of the relationship. So we have those conversations, and then we stay in contact with our mentors and mentees and ask them questions. I like, go back to customer discovery. Customer discovery doesn't stop when you launch, right? You have to continue to go through customer discovery to make sure what you're doing is actually impactful. So we're constantly getting feedback from students, like what's working, what's not working, who's a good mentor, who's been a good connection with you, who hasn't, and find out why. Same thing on the mentor side. Get feedback from them. What's working, what's not working. What are you seeing from students? What are some good students, and what are some students you might think need some help, where I can step in as more of a administrator or an employee, for lack of better terms, to step in and actually help them. So it is about setting that expectation up front, and then making sure that we're in constant communication with them throughout the process.
One of your roles, Louis, at NC State was assistant provost. Should a university's entrepreneurship center report within a specific college like business or engineering, or should it report to the provost to ensure and promote inclusivity across all disciplines?
I think the answer is it depends, right? It depends. One of the reasons we made that change at NC State was because of what you just said. Like we were trying to send a signal that it was inclusive for all disciplines, and we wanted to make sure that the silos were not as easily seen, and that students recognize they could go across campuses and engage with each other. I'm not concerned about that here at SLU, because even though I'm housed in the business school and I report to the dean, when I took this job, I met with every dean here. Most of them were the ones that were proactive, reaching out to me to say, look, we want this in our colleges and schools. We're going to support you. Let's do it, right? So it really depends on the environment that you're in, whether it has to be on that university level or inside one of the schools. But the message has to be clear. that it's for all students. It's not just for one group of students versus another group of students, that entrepreneurship really adds value to every discipline, whether you're a history major or a business major or an engineering major or pre-med or a lawyer. Like, it's going to add value to your experience.
How does teaching social entrepreneurship, market-driven approaches that benefit society, serving the common good, how does that differ from teaching commercial entrepreneurship? Is it a definitional, not a practical difference only?
I think it's a definitional. I've always had a hard time of how do you separate them. Like, I've never taught students like go out and ruin the world and make a lot of money. Like that's not what happens in class, right? It's more about go out, recognize an opportunity, build a solution for it, and create impact, right? And we've always got this positive component to it. It's, you know, I talk to students all the time. Entrepreneurship by no means is easy, right? There's nothing about entrepreneurship that's really easy, but it's worth it, right? And when you find the thing that's really important and powerful to you, and you're willing to pursue it, and you're willing to make the sacrifices and the resiliency that's needed to succeed, you recognize what that worth is to you, right? So that applies to, you know, the definitions of commercial entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship. I don't know, other than definition, what the differences are. Those, we're not teaching students not to be socially conscious about what they're doing. And I think the market tells us that as well, right? Again, going back to customer discovery, the customer is going to tell us what's important. What do we need to focus on as a company or product or a solution that's meaningful to them in our society that we live in? So I've always been all are welcome, right? That's the approach, all are welcome. And so, and I think that makes entrepreneurship programs better. Like, if I have a student that's really focused on a truly, by definition, social entrepreneurial venture, and I might have a student right beside them focus on a technology venture that might not have the social components that we might put in the definition, having them work side by side makes both of them better, right? So that's been my approach all along.
I have asked this question of all trusted peer thought leader interviewees. What is the single most important course a university student can take, and the course that should be a core course for all? Is it a course on the scientific method or a course on critical thinking? You know, how are the scientific method and critical thinking similar, and how are they different?
Yeah, I've watched your videos before. I go back to, I think the most important course a student should take is communications. You got to be able to communicate with people in life, and it goes that third component of the entrepreneurial mindset of being able to articulate your message. And whether that's a public speaking class that makes people frightened when they hear that they have to take a public speaking class, or it's defined as a communications class, like getting students to truly understand how to communicate with one another and how to communicate across generations is tremendously important, and probably more important now than ever before. Students don't communicate like you and I did when we were in school. Students communicate in different ways in terms of social media, quick snippets, 15 seconds at a time, where you and I might think email is perfectly fine, and they're not going to connect that way. So I think that communication class is probably the most important class for students across all disciplines at this stage, so they are better prepared to be able to tell what their vision is, and then be able to execute on that.
When was the last time you had an email exchange with a student?
I jokingly told students last night, if I had their physical address, I would have driven over there and made them respond to my email before class, because they were taking so long and driving me crazy. It's become a problem. Yeah, we literally have Slack now, we have Teams, we have email. I have text message threads with students. Like, whatever I need to get them to communicate, I'm willing to do that, but they need to understand the rest of the world's not going to just bend to the way they want to communicate.
Yeah, it's you know, students log into, you know, their university accounts with their email account that they were given, And I think that's the last time they ever used that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think you're right.
Louis, you have more than 20 years experience in managing university entrepreneurship centers and programs as an educator, as well as a practitioner with multiple startup experiences. What is the ideal background for a university entrepreneurship center director to meet the evolving needs and demands of the 2020s?
I think you need exposure to both sides. I think you need to understand what it's really like to make payroll, for example. Like how to run a company is important. It doesn't mean you went out and necessarily launched a company, but have that exposure through advising companies, working with companies to get started, as well as how to be a good teacher. The teaching component, really, the message can get lost if you're not really a good teacher. And I think both of those come back to being authentic and truly caring about the students. Like if I could get center directors or faculty across the country, like, and most of them do, right? That's what's so cool about entrepreneurship educators across the country is they do have this component of they really care about their students. Like that's really the differentiator between the programs that are at the top and the programs that aren't mentioned. For the most part, is you have these people that are leaning in and really care about their students more than most people would think, right? That they become their kids. And my mom's a teacher, and she used to say that when I was a kid, and I never understood what she meant, but completely buy into that. Like I care about these kids in my class every semester, just like they're my own kids, and I want them to be successful. Like those pieces all together are really the things going to make the difference.
Okay, last question here.
Okay.
What would you advise universities and directors that are just starting their entrepreneurship centers and programs? What are the curricular and co-curricular programs that they should start with?
So let me give a different piece of advice versus listing all things that you focus on. What if I were brand new starting this today, if I go back 20 plus years ago, what I would have done differently was I would go talk to other people, just like we teach our students to do customer discovery.
Right.
I would do that, right? And that means I'd go talk to other center directors. There's so many, like show up to the conferences every year, talk to other center directors and learn from them. We have such a great support system of entrepreneurship educators in this country that's where I'd start. Like learn from what their mistakes and what they're doing well. But then I'd go back to the students and I'd really focus on what are their needs, not necessarily what they tell me their needs are, right? They don't necessarily know what their needs are, right? That's what customer discovery is. Like listen to them and understand the pieces that are missing and then put those two together, right? And that will lead to that experiential learning, getting them embedded in the ecosystem, the mentoring program and advisorships that are needed, the incubators and accelerators, and then the funding components that are going to be more programmatic, but it's all sort of built on, what's the true need there.
Louis, this was a great interview. I really appreciate your insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. I had a blast, and thanks for including me.